Go.
All right, it's recording. Good. Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you tonight, and we have some guests on with us tonight. And I know there's others that wanted to be here and couldn't be here tonight, but they can catch the recording later, hopefully. But tonight we're talking about what's at stake. That's the title of our message tonight, or the seminar. And what we're doing tonight is just talking about some of the issues that are at stake in the upcoming election. And just things that we as Christians need to be thinking about, concerned about. And we're just so blessed to have Jeff Patty with us again. Welcome, Jeff. And good to have him. And Jeff's going to basically lead this whole seminar. He's going to take maybe the first hour or so, Jeff, whatever you need there to share some things with us. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And in the question and answer time, you can do one of several things. You can unmute your audio and video and ask the question live if you'd like, or you can use the chat box down there. Just click on the little chat thing down at the bottom where it says chat there, and you can send a question out to everyone. Down at the bottom of the chat box it says to everyone, or you could send that directly to me. Or to Jeff. It might be better just to send it to me, and then I can relay the questions to Jeff out loud. But in that way, he won't have to worry about it. But if you can write them, or you can send them out loud. Either one you want to do. So, Jeff, is there anything else we need to say to get started here before we get going?
Not much. I think just ground rules. We're going to focus mostly on policies and positions, and you know, try to make sure that regardless if we get into these kind of conversations, there are definitely different views, and so just want to make sure that, and I know this church we definitely will, but just respect with how we approach and how we think about these topics for sure for others.
Yeah. And if you have questions, you know, some of the things that Jeff covers, he's talking about policies, positions, things like that, may not cover specifically your question, but you may find out that in the covering of a broader issue, it might answer your question in the process. You know, that may happen. So be thinking about some of those things as we go through. Let's just pray as we get started, and then we'll just turn it over to Jeff and let him take it from there. God, we're grateful for the night. We're grateful to have Jeff with us, and we're grateful for the knowledge and the expertise you have blessed him with, and the training. And God, we pray that you'll just work through him tonight to share with us the things that need to be shared, the things that are on your heart, God, that you want to share. So bless him and give him just an insight and wisdom tonight as he shares. And bless us, God. We'll have the right spirit and right attitude with each other. I know that sometimes issues can be divisive, or they can be emotional and cause friction, but we pray that won't be the case, that you'll just help us all to be seekers of the truth, to look for what is your will, what is your heart in these various issues, these various policies or programs or whatever, God. And we just want to honor you and serve you, and we pray that in the upcoming election that your name will be glorified and magnified in so many, many different ways. So God, just bless us and give us a heart for you, a heart for this country you blessed us with, and we just honor you and praise you tonight, and pray that this whole evening will just be dedicated to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so let's go ahead and right now we can mute our audio and video, and we can listen to Jeff, and then at the end we can tune back in and begin to ask questions. Okay, Jeff, thank you.
Great. Well, guys, thank you so much. Look, this is really special for me, so I appreciate everybody being here, participating, letting me share like we're going to do. Also, just as we laid out the ground rules kind of at the very beginning, just echo that. I'm going to be the first, like I said, to admit I don't necessarily have all of this, you know, together either. There's a lot of this stuff here. The point is that we're gathered here to reason together, which is a really good thing. And I've got a lot of neat things I want to talk about. I'm really excited about them. But I think we've spent the last few weeks talking about the fact that there is truth, and also talking about how sometimes that can be offensive one way or the other. So just want to call that out up front and say thanks for being here tonight. Also, really important, and this is going to go without saying really, but whatever comes from the end of the night, we're to seek God and pray for his will, as Russ just mentioned in his prayer. Pray, vote your conscience in November. Do vote. I think we're responsible, like we talked about a few weeks ago, for this under God. But seek his will about it, and make sure, that, especially in this critical time, that you participate, but that you do so prayerfully. So as Russ, we talked about tonight, we're going to focus on what's at stake in the coming election. We're going to talk about a few different things, many of which are all over the news. I'll give a presentation sort of on a few topics that I think are particularly pertinent. The ones I've picked, I'm trying to do so because I believe they cover a broad swath of things. In fact, I'll lay some foundation up front. We'll spend a little bit of time on that I think helps us to understand the issues. Sometimes the issues are up high, and the foundation sort of can help make sense of those topics at the top by the base. And so we'll talk about the base first, but we'll then obviously get to Q&A. If I don't hit on anything in particular during this first part, don't feel like you have to restrict it to what we talked about. When we get to Q&A, we'll discuss any number of things. It's open. Naturally, I expect there may be questions about things that have been in the news recently. Maybe questions about critical race theory or systemic racism, right? Hot topic buttons like what to do with COVID. I know we received one of the questions earlier about COVID and restrictions and what makes sense there. Maybe electoral college. Should we just scrap that? If you were with me a few weeks ago when we talked at church, you should kind of know that my position is going to be on that, but shouldn't we just have a popular vote? Isn't it just the will of the people? And so we'll talk about what the electoral college is about and why it's important, in particular because it's an issue that's actually on the ballot in Colorado this year. So I want to make sure we have some background on what that is. We'll talk about socialism. That's been a big subject for the last year or so, in particular from the Democratic Party, that has been talking a lot about socialism. So a little of what it is. We'll talk social values. We'll talk about taxes. Yay. We'll talk about Russia. Not that I think any of us want to talk any more about Russia at this point, but we can if you want to. I think it also revealed a particular interesting point about the nature of DC and what's going on in DC. So that's certainly on the table if we want to get there. But we'll not go ahead on everything, and that's clear. So just know that that's sort of how we want to set tonight up. To start off, though, I think before we go anywhere, I want to take a step back, as I mentioned, and ask one fundamental question as we start. I think it's key as a guidepost for everything else. So one is, what is it that makes a country truly great, or strong, or exceptional, in a sense of exceptional? Is it just the strength of your economy, or maybe the strength of your military? Because if that's the case, you can look back in history at Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, just start the list, right? There are empires and kingdoms that come on the scene and fade, and come on the scene and fade. What about consensus of thought with the people themselves? Is that what might make people great? If they just have a people that all are together. We have this sort of in our own history of a divided people cannot stand. We see that in scripture as well. Are you great just because you're unified under a thought?
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, if you look at the North Koreans today, maybe at bayonet point, but they're highly united under one single thought, right? So what is it? Is it about how educated, whether or not they have great technology or innovation or what have you? Well, if that's the case, guys, then the Nazis were a tremendously exceptional society because they were one of the most educated people of their time, which also can tell you the limitations of education on morality alone, right? Because they entered World War II as one of the most educated people. Is it the color of your skin? Is it your height? Is it the shade of your hair? All that sort of stuff. Is it the speed of your athletes? Is it the quantity of your resources? What I would suggest, and I think you guys know from what we've talked about where we're going to go, what I would suggest is that what really makes something exceptional is not power or prestige or any others, but principle. And just to preach for just a second, when Joshua crossed over the Jordan to begin the conquest of the promised land, if you remember the story, this is in Joshua 5:13 to about 16:2. When he crossed over, he met the angel of the Lord's armies, essentially the Lord. And it says, and this is the quote now from the verse, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and asked, 'Are you for us or for our enemies?' The reply is great. The reply is neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And Joshua did so. And then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with the king and its fighting men. Now I read this because, number one, I think it's so insightful that Joshua, like we might do, came to the Lord and said, are you with me? And the Lord immediately spun the question. That's not what this is about. No. But the question is about whether you're with me. See, I believe that what makes a country exceptional has nothing to do with the country's strength, their ability, their ethnicity, their resources, their cunning, or anything else that the world fancies. But what makes a country exceptional, what makes it really great, is the position it takes before God, and to the extent the principles for which it stands stem from Him. So it is whether those truths that we hold as self-evident, the ones that we talked so much about recently, whether those are truly from God, and whether we can join Him in it. So I want to spend just a little time here as we start this evening to remind you of who we are as Americans, how we got our start, and what we're about. What made this place special?
I don't want this.
So special. Here, one second. So special that people from all over the world flocked here and continue to flock here. And they flock here. Why? Because they're fleeing oppression. They're looking for opportunity. They're looking for any number of those things, but they have come. And I argue too that it's not just because of our wealth, because they were fleeing here or coming here or knocking on the door to please be in here long before we were the wealthiest country. But they were doing so in most cases because of freedom. And so tonight, I would like to start off with just a little something that we'll call, Did You Know? We'll just call it a little segment, Did You Know? So Josh, I don't know if I've got control yet or not. If not, we'll see if we can make this switch here.
Yep, give me 1 sec.
Great.
Got it now.
Awesome. All right. So let me do this. I'll share screen and you guys can tell me if the slideshow actually presents as the larger slide. Josh, I'll look to you just so we don't have everybody.
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, so we all know the story of, we'll start sort of with the Pilgrims. And we all know the story of the Pilgrims, right? They were fleeing religious persecution. And I've got a lot of information here on screen, but the important thing, I find this really interesting. Number one, and first, of course, they have the compact in the top right, and they talk about their mission. And their mission is for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. That's what's highlighted. They also set down, and I highlighted the second part, about forming a body politic, which is basically creating a democratic or democracy movement, even though they were still beholden to the king. But if you know the story of the Pilgrims, and Linda and I got to go and see a replica of it when we were up in Massachusetts, which, by the way, is quite a small ship if it's actually the size. But when we were talking with one of the employees there who is dressed in the regalia of the time and acts as sort of a museum representative, and we were explaining, or she was explaining to us how it worked for the Pilgrims. They were aiming for Northern Virginia and missed. They hit Massachusetts, which is a little funny today because of all the technology we have, but they were, of course, blown off course. Interestingly, they were blown to a place of uninhabited land. The land had been cultivated, but the people group who had inhabited it had actually all died off from disease before they arrived. And they happened to land in a spot of land that had two Indians nearby in the adjacent tribe that spoke varying levels of English. In fact, Squanto, who you may remember these names from forever ago, was quite fluent in English. He had spent time in the UK, or at the time in England. And so I think it's neat. They came, they landed, God provided a spot for them to be. They still went through terrible trials and tribulations. They still had to go through all the hardships, but they dedicated the land and dedicated the place to be a city on the hill. In fact, John Winthrop, who became the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colonies, had a very famous sermon where he explains just that. This is to be a city on a hill. So from the very first footsteps, this is what was called upon. We talked a little bit about this before. This is the painting, although I put one in color this time, of the prayer of the First Continental Congress. I also have on the right some of the words of the prayer, and I believe it was longer than this, but I'll just read just briefly the part that's highlighted, which says, and they're talking, of course, to God, "Look down in mercy, we beseech thee, on these our American states who have fled to thee from the rod of the oppressor and thrown themselves on thy gracious protection, desiring to be henceforth dependent only on thee. To thee have they appealed for the righteousness of their cause, and to thee do they now look up for the countenance and support which thou alone canst give. So I like this painting, of course, because of the seriousness. This is not just a formal prayer at the opening of Congress. They're on their knees pleading for God's intervention. Now we get to here. This is the Constitutional Convention. They're no longer fearing Britain. The war has been won. And interestingly, when they started the Constitutional Convention, several weeks went by and they didn't start it with prayer. And this is not trying to paint a picture of these guys as more stately than they ought to be considered. These are human beings. They wrestle with stuff just like you and I might. But when they got weeks into the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin, who is believed to be one of the least religious of the founding fathers, stood up and provided a very famous now motion to the group. And he beseeched that they now seek in prayer God's guidance. And he has a really beautiful way of speaking that only Franklin can do. And I'll only read the highlighted part, but it says, all of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And by the way, speaking to that, what he's saying is, even if you look in 1776, there were instances of sort of strange things that happened that would help the colonials, that they could look at and ponder what is going on here. Fog lifting in a certain way, fog setting in a certain way, different things happening that gave them an advantage to help them along in their path, even though they still had to go through the struggle. But he says there were observed frequent instances of superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? And I'll give you a little background. As I mentioned before, they were like us. They were working through this. They were trying to understand how best to form a government. They've been given this opportunity by unique circumstances of history to form a government of their choosing. And they didn't pray at the beginning of the convention. And Franklin now motioned for them to pray. And interestingly enough, we believe we can see from the record that the initial motion by Franklin to begin he actually moved to hire clergy to come in every morning and pray before the convention started. And they rejected that motion. And they rejected it in part because they were concerned about what people would think, not because they thought people would be against prayer, but because they thought it would be a sign that people would see that they were no longer being able to come to, that they were desperate. And so instead, you hear the human pressure, right? Instead, what they did is they did a second motion, and they decided that they would join together at church on July 4th, which was an upcoming Sunday, and that they would then pray for God's favor and seek him humbly for his guidance. And as such, they did, and there's actually some record of that prayer as well. And from it, I believe, from that appeal, they were given favor. And they came out with a constitution that we had today. So from the beginning with the founding with the Pilgrims, you have beseeching the Lord for his favor and setting us to be a city on the hill. From 1776 is the onset of the Revolution. You have them seeking God's favor and for his protection, for his guidance. And even here at the convention, you still have them struggling and struggling and struggling until they go to church and seeking God for his guidance on what nation to set up. Now, in the Civil War, we even have this, and I also talked a little bit about this, but the Proclamation from Thanksgiving by Lincoln. This is amazing. It's only a few months after Gettysburg when he lists this, and he talks about the bounties and the wonders for which they've been blessed, which is tremendous perspective given the circumstances. But he also calls upon the people, as president, calls upon the people to pray and give thanks to our Father who dwelleth in the heavens. So he says, no human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God. Now, I won't read on the rest of what's highlighted, and you can certainly pull up his proclamation of Thanksgiving. But what the point I wanted to drive at is at our critical moments, whether it was from the very first footsteps, and yes, there was Jamestown down in Virginia, but from the very first footsteps of the pilgrims who dedicated this land to God and for the sharing of the gospel, to the 76 or 74 first, when we were looking in prayer to God for his guidance with the revolution, to the time of the convention where you see human nature still coming in, but a people still trying to seek the king, even to the Civil War, where we give great thanks to the Lord in the midst of a tremendous battle. But one of the things that's coming against us, and I'm going to flip here just for a second, one of the things that's coming against us right now is a bit of looking at our history and trying to view it from the perspective of slavery. And I hit on all of this, by the way, because again, I think this is a foundation for why they did what they did. And one key point that was momentous before they hit the revolution was the First Great Awakening. And I don't have time to go into it, but it was a time of revival and of coming to the king that lasted for almost a generation before the revolution, or even into the revolution. And it led to such concepts that we have of these truths that are self-evident. And it led to these concepts of God-given rights. And so with the Great Awakening, you had not only the revolution, but you also had a recognition and a better understanding that the sins of slavery and what it was. So a lot of people look at Washington and Jefferson, by the way, and they say, but these guys were just hypocrites. They were just slave owners. They didn't really believe in the freedom of men. We should burn this all down because they don't really, they were just going out. This was just a power play. They were just going out for themselves. The reality was, much like as they wrestled at the Convention for the Constitution, Washington and Jefferson both wrestled themselves with slavery. They were both slave owners. Washington inherited most of his slaves when he was 11. And interestingly, there's actually rules at the time in Virginia that made it very difficult, if all but impossible, to release your slaves. And in some cases, if you could release one or two at a time, they were required to leave the state and be separated from their families that were on your property. And so it was very difficult. It wasn't as simple as just set someone free. But at the same time, what you would find from Washington and Jefferson are things like what Jefferson quotes here when he's talking about slavery. And can the liberties of a nation, this is the highlighted part, be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Jefferson was talking about slavery there. And he was talking about the very fact that they had come to the conclusion that God has made men equal and that he has given them freedom, and yet they had not finished off by ending slavery. In fact, in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence years before, Jefferson actually included that one of the reasons we were separating from Britain was because Britain had required the slavery and the slave trade. And he included the language that you have here. He, the King of England, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of the most distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. And he goes on. It was stricken from the draft of the Declaration, in part because the coalition could not get some of the southern states on board. And the wisdom and the thinking of the time was they couldn't fight two wars at once. And so what they did instead is they introduced into the Constitution what the abolitionists believed was a bit of a poison pill for slavery, to destroy slavery, which was called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause says that you can only count a slave in slave states as 3/5 of a person. Many people look at that and think, that's just evidence of their mindset. And instead, it was actually introduced into our Constitution. If you ever read our Constitution, you see that line. It was introduced by our brothers and sisters in churches who are abolitionists, who wanted to reduce the power of the South by reducing the number of people counted towards their votes and towards their legislative authority. So if you count your House of Representatives by the population of your people, this was reducing the effect the South was going to have. And it was thought that by doing so, we could actually end slavery peacefully. Now we, with hundreds of years of history since, know that's not what happened. But I just pointed to all of this because I wanted you to see a people that were wrestling truly with the concepts of freedom and even with oppression, with slavery, and wrestling with it. This is not a story when it comes to the United States of a move of just oppression. It is a story of a move of freedom. And really quickly here, I find it fascinating that the very first person who was killed in the American Revolution at the Boston Tea Party was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Now, he was actually a black and American Indian descent, as far as we know, and he was the first martyr. I've also listed Phyllis Wheatley over here on the right, who is an intellectual and poet, whose words helped to stir up the patriotic sentiments of the revolution and drive it forward. And she has a famous poem which she wrote about General Washington. And he read it and actually wrote her back about some of it. The heroes at Bunker Hill were both black men, Salem Poor and Peter Salem. In fact, Peter Salem was actually a Minuteman at Lexington and Concord before. And of the 2,400 Americans at Bunker Hill, over 100 were either black or American Indians. I mentioned this, by the way, Bunker Hill, if you don't know your history, was one of the very, very first battles of the American Revolution. And it's one where, while we lost the ground, we were able to demonstrate to the British that this was not going to be an easy fight. They very much took the lopsided casualties on it. This individual, this guy is extremely, extremely impressive. His name is James Armistead Lafayette, and he's the gentleman on the right. He was a former slave and he was a patriot. And he offered his services to the patriotic cause, to Washington and them. And what he ended up doing was becoming a spy. And so he goes over to the British and he says that he's a runaway slave and he wants to work for them, but he's actually a spy for the Americans. The British, in turn, decide to make him a spy and send him into the American camp, but he ends up as a double agent. I don't know if this makes sense or not. He goes to the British, spying on them, gets sent by the British to be a spy on the Americans, and then working with the Americans sends disinformation back to the British. And he was really critical on major efforts of battle plans and other things. A very impressive individual. So last thing on the presentation, then we're gonna get back. This is the battle hymn of the, actually second to last thing, this is the battle hymn of the Republic. The sentiment in the time of the Civil War, because there's been some revisionists that tried to come back about what the Civil War was really about. The sense of the time of the Civil War was about slavery. If you go back and you read the charters and the secession documents and the reasons that the South left, and if you read a lot of the reasons why the North was so riled up and willing to go and fight and lose, because in total, America lost 600,000 white men during this war. If you go back and read it, it was about slavery. There were other things, there were tariffs, there were other issues, but it was about ending slavery. And if you look at just the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which I imagine many of us are very familiar with, it actually has, it's all about this. It's talking about the wrath of God coming upon the South for what it deserves and what it should get for what it did with the institution of slavery. And it actually ends with the very famous lines, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on." When they marched to Atlanta, the Union soldiers were singing hymns as they marched. They were praising God and singing hymns as they marched because they were ending slavery. And lastly, I'll go back, circle full back to the time of the Revolution with Thomas Paine at 1776. And Paine tried to help explain to the population of America then what was at stake. He said, "O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted around the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." Now, I spent a little time to go through that because I want us to understand a couple of things. One, like we've highlighted, the founding was about freedom, and it was about principles of God, and it was even about principles of God through prayer and seeking after his wisdom. There are atrocities in this country that are very real and that happened. But finding atrocities in a kingdom or an empire or country are not difficult. Everyone in history has those, and not to diminish any of them. But what's amazing and what's remarkable is a country that, of its own, without being attacked from the outside or without an uprising, on its own, drove itself more and more towards greater freedom. So the story of America, if I would, is clearly of imperfect people, no doubt, but of many principled people submitted to God, shining their light to the world, often at great peril to themselves, into the story, not of one of oppression, as I said, but of a march toward freedom. And they understood that it meant to be dominated by a government, and they understood what it was like to be slaves to political leaders. As we talked about in 1 Samuel 8, their leaders, the old kings and emperors of the old world, promised them safety and security. But always is that promise must be at the expense of personal liberty. So now we stand on a precipice, right? We get to go and vote, and we get to go in our time and make a decision about what our government will look like. And we have that right because of all the sacrifices they made. And we have a question: should we tear down this last great asylum for mankind as Paine prescribed it? I have almost an image like the Helm's Deep fortress, right? Or should we instead finish building on the foundations that they laid? And should we finish shoring up the holes in the walls that may have been left by them that they didn't complete? Like in the times of Nehemiah, we can grumble that the wall is down or that our enemy is pressing us on every side, or we can take a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other and go finish the work. Now, one focus, guys: country after country on this earth is centralized governments and control, with varying differences, and some with virtually unlimited power. But we are different. We have a limited government with checks and balances. And so, quick civics: we don't have a straight democracy, because if a straight democracy, it's like we described before, two wolves and a lamb voting for what's for dinner. We'll talk about that with electoral college. And we don't have a centralized form of government, because as God warned in 1 Samuel 8, that can lead to tyranny in its own right. The bigger the government gets, the smaller the person gets. So our founders warned us in Federalist Paper 53 that men are not angels, so you have to set ambition against ambition. So we stand on that same precipice. One side is an argument to consolidate more and more of our power and more control of fewer and fewer people. Always, of course, for the greater good is the argument. But on the other side is to hold off that consolidation and to hold back and to leave the power that is still with the people to the people. And what that means is that we will not have a government that promises to take care of everything, but instead we'll have to trust God. So with that, let's dive into our homework, and let's kick off with socialism. And I laid all that foundation because I want us to understand that as we come in, as you hear the promises of just give me a little bit more of your liberty and I will take care of you. Just give me a little bit more of your liberty and I will defend you. I will protect you. I will make sure that you are safe and okay. Your ears should go up, and you should think back to the time of 76 and all the effort that it took to get out from underneath a king who promised to protect us and to take care of us and to look after us. So what is socialism, and why do we need to talk about it? Well, number one, Democrats have been pushing the socialist agenda this time around. And I kind of would joke that they've been pushing it bigly in honor of our current president, right? They've been pushing it this time around, and it's one of their key platform items. In the last debate, the only debate so far, the presidential debate, Vice President Biden actually made a point to try to separate himself from that and to say that he was the Democratic Party, as if he was trying to say he was going to protect us from the wing of his party that was pushing for socialism. But why? Why is that needed, right? Why would he need to protect us? So what is socialism? One second, guys, sorry. So in its most base form, guys, socialism is the idea of trying to consolidate more and more of the resources and the production power into a central form, and then having those individuals divvy it out as they see best fit to the masses. And the intent is to try to be fair. And it sounds right, and it sounds good. And you hear as we move more and more towards that, as more things are promised. Let the government provide you with free X. Let us provide you with free shelter, or with free healthcare, or with free X or Y or Z, whatever it is, education. And your ears should go up, and you should think, number one, what is free? Can something be free that's being provided by the government? It's not free magically just because the government provides it. So that's why you often hear tagged right along with it the concept of, we'll have the rich pay for it. And it comes with this idea that the rich are somehow, we deserve to have what they have. We deserve to have them pay for A, B, C, or D, or whatever it is. But when we look in Scripture, what the Bible actually talks about is to be careful not to covet what our neighbors have. And we may look at them and say, yes, but this is a need. I need A, B, C, and D. And so shouldn't this guy over here pay for it? He has a lot, or she has a lot of money. Shouldn't they pay for it? But the Bible says that we are to love our neighbors. We are called to love our neighbors. We're not called to put the sword of the state against another person and make them love our neighbors. It's us. We have that responsibility. And so when we look at socialism, it comes across at first, right, as a nice thing. It comes across first as we're trying to help people. This is the fair thing. It's a justice thing. But underneath its belly, it's actually got a lot of the oppressive potential, and it's demonstrated that throughout history of what we were fleeing from back in 76. The same thing. So let's look at payment. Who pays for it? If it's not free, who pays for it? Is it the rich? Well, they don't have enough money to pay for it, number one. That may come across as shocking to you, but they don't. Number two, if they don't, what do? Well, we naturally go deeper into debt. We tax ourselves first, but we also go deeper into debt. So if we go deeper into debt, is that just a magical piggy bank that we can keep drawing from? Because if it is, why stop at free healthcare? And why stop at free education? Why not free houses and free cars and free planes and free boats? Why stop? Well, the reason is because as you go deeper in debt, and this will get a little technical, but what actually happens is you start to devalue the dollar. And so the money in your bank account that sits there today begins to become less valuable. And so if you have $100 sitting there, it becomes worth 90. Its buying power becomes worth 80. It may still say 100, but what you can buy with it becomes less and less because the things around you become more expensive. And if you think that actually disproportionately impacts the rich, you're wrong, because a lot of their holdings are in things like equity and precious metals and other things like that. They actually have, in some cases, the wherewithal to protect themselves from some type of inflation that I'm describing. And so who does it impact the most? You may hear the mantra of it's the rich that are going to pay for it.
No.
But actually, it's coming from debt, which impacts us. It impacts all of us. And the second thing who pays for it is our kids and our grandkids. We're charging a credit card that'll get billed to them. So then from a moral standpoint, we need to ask our question, is it just for me to allow my government to provide me with A, B, and C, whatever it is that they call as free, and make my kids and my grandkids pay for it? Is that okay? Is that moral? Now, if I see somebody that's hurting on the side of the road, none of that changes it. This is not a binary question of do I help the orphan or the widow or the person that's hurting. This is not a binary question between the two. It's not, I have to have socialism or I can't help them. That is not it at all. Although it gets portrayed that way oftentimes when we talk politics. Instead, the question is it the responsibility of government to take care of that person? Or is it my responsibility? Is it my job? God called me, and he called you, and he called us as the church to go take care of them. In fact, when you look around at the hospitals all over the Denver area, look at the names of the hospitals. Not all of them are faith-based originally, but you've got your Lutheran hospitals, your Presbyterian hospitals, your Catholic hospitals. Why? We are called to take care of the lame and the sick. All of us, all people, but as a church in particular, we're called to love our neighbors. But I want you to focus carefully because it's a bit of a trick. When they come out and say, I'm offering you free education, and this person doesn't want to give it to you, it's not free. Nothing is magically free because it has the government tag to it. It's just someone else's pain. And then you have to ask, is it okay to force the sword of the state that person to pay? Now, my kids and I, we pulled up on Disney the Robin Hood cartoon the other night. In fact, I think it was last night. The cute little one with the fox and the bear. And it was going through the story of Robin Hood. And the story of Robin Hood, a lot of people misconstrue as an idea of stealing from the rich to give to the poor. And as if it's a moral thing. It's good to steal from the rich to give to the poor. That's not true. It's not. And Robin Hood isn't about that, by the way, either, if you know the history. It was actually about oppressive taxation. It was about the state coming in and taxing what they didn't have a right to tax.
Yep.
And then it was about Robin Hood coming and giving it back to the people. So it was about the state stealing from people and Robin Hood returning what was stolen. It's actually a flip on its head. It's if anything, it's against the idea of socialism. And from that time, because Robin Hood was a real character, from that time, it was about the era of the Magna Carta, when we first started to unleash this idea of freedom back in the 1200s. So no, I would posit to you that socialism is not something that is moral or just or simply about taking care of people. It's actually a dereliction of our duty to love our neighbors. It's my responsibility, not my responsibility to hold the sword of the state and make him do it. It's my job. So it's immoral in that sense, number one. And number two, if we advocate for taking from any people group, whether it's by the amount they have or whatever, simply based on that alone and not proportionate, simply based on that alone, then it's potentially theft. The government can steal through taxation. And from the very beginning, our founders also understood that with the power of taxation was the power to destroy. So be very careful as you hear all the promises and protections during any election cycle. And they come out and say, I can promise you X. And they say it's free. It's not free. And in fact, you may actually be paying for it. And if not, your kids may be paying for it. And if not, if someone else is paying for it, is it even right and moral and just under God for them to have to do so? Which I think leads us to taxes. So there's a number of items on the Colorado ballot about taxes. At the federal level, the Republicans and Democrats have very different views on taxes. Vice President Biden mentioned in the last debate that he does intend to raise taxes on the middle class and on others. President Trump has, in his first 4 years, actually reduced taxes. But the point about taxes, too, is, if you look at when you look at initiatives, particularly Colorado is really good about this. When we have our Blue Book, they're always really good with this about coming out and saying, hey, look, if you want to have X, if you want to pave your roads, or if you want to have education for your children, you need to raise taxes here. And again, they try to make it as if it's a binary choice. If you don't raise taxes, you can't have this. You can't pave your roads. But it's a false choice. The budget at the Colorado state level is already billions of dollars. What they're not telling you is they have decided not to provide for, in the budget, this. And instead, they've selected from a whole list of other items that they could have chosen. So it's not a decision of, do I fund this? And to do so, I have to raise taxes. It's a decision of, do I fund this? And to do so, I either have to raise taxes or I have to cut spending. And it's this cut spending piece that they don't talk about. And so when you see something on the ballot like this, it's about raising taxes, you have to make a decision not whether or not you want to raise taxes to get X. That's actually not the issue at all. The question you have to ask yourself is, does the government have enough money today to do what's required? Period. And if you go and look at the things that they're providing and you find things that you think are not necessary for the government to do, then you've already decided they have enough money today. And instead of coming back and asking for more money, they should balance the budget that they have and deal with the amount of money they have for paving the roads and educating their kids, and stop doing things on the other side that are not necessarily as required. In fact, a better thing to do would not be for them to come in this and say, we can't pay, and I don't think it's paved roads this time, but it was last time, we can't pave our roads unless you raise taxes. And instead, them come and say, we as legislators have decided that whatever we're about to put up here is the least most important thing. It's the thing we're going to cut if you don't raise taxes. If they would actually provide us that, then we'd have full transparency. But that's not what happens when it comes to taxes, right? So just be aware when you're looking at taxes, and particularly in Colorado, and they say, is this or this? That's not the binary choice. The real question is, do you think they have enough money to do what they're trying to do today? Moving quickly to the next thing, guys, I want to talk Supreme Court. If you've been following the news, you know that Amy Coney Barrett has been nominated by the president to fill a seat in the Supreme Court. It's unclear right now whether or not she'll be confirmed by the Senate. So in the next coming, for this election, the next term for the president, whether it's President Trump or Vice President Biden, over the next 4 years, they will likely have up to 3 justices. Again, depending on whether or not Amy is confirmed, they will likely have 3 new justices. And it could be more. Justice Stephen Breyer is in his 80s. He's a very liberal justice. He will likely be rolling off. Justice Clarence Thomas is in his 70s, and he may roll off on over this next 4 years. Justice Clarence Thomas is a very conservative justice. So you have the filling of the seat that was vacated by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You have potentially the filling of a seat by and you have the filling of a seat like Clarence Thomas. Now, why is this important? How does this even work inside our system, right? So the Supreme Court makes decisions on constitutionality of issues. And over the last few years, they've instead started to do what's called legislating from the bench. And I won't dive too deep into that, but just know that what they've started to do is create things from the Constitution, like we'll use abortion as the example. In Roe v. Wade in the 70s, they said they created a fundamental right. They based it in the concept of privacy because they had a hard time coming out and explicitly saying it was about abortion, even though the whole opinion was abortion. But they based it a fundamental right, effectively, to an abortion. And what that means from our jurisprudence and from history and from the concepts of the Declaration that these rights are given to us by God is the Supreme Court basically decided that we have a fundamental right, a God-given right to an abortion. Now, if they can decide that kind of thing, and if we have 3 individuals that are coming up potentially that are going to be replaced, the balance of power in that court will be swayed significantly over the next 4 years. The Supreme Court will decide issues like abortion. It will decide issues like religious liberty and freedom. It will decide issues like the sanctity of marriage. On religious liberty, for example, there could be issues that come before the court in the next 4 years or in the next 15, because these people stay on for a life term once they're nominated. That could be as offensive to us now as a loyalty test at work. And what I mean by this is you may find yourself where you work in maybe a large corporation, and that corporation requires you, as an effort for stopping discrimination, to adhere or to sign off on certain agreements or what have you. And it may be that you have to agree, not just that you won't discriminate on the basis of things that you do agree with, race or ethnicity, that you won't, and not that you won't discriminate on the basis of maybe homosexual movement, LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bi, transgender, or otherwise, right? That you won't discriminate on those, but that instead, that you may actually have to adhere that and accept those notions as things that are right and good. I know that I already see in a workplace where there's now optional meetings to come and celebrate some of these things that are clearly within Scripture, like the sanctity of marriage, that they're clearly against those things in Scripture. And we're to come and celebrate these in the workplace. It's not a long leap to say instead that you actually have to now to agree with these things to continue in this workplace, because this is what the work is about. And if we don't have a Supreme Court that can protect some of these issues, you could find that religious liberty and religious freedom that we take in some ways for granted now will start to be pushed and pushed, where you have to decide, do I continue to proclaim and believe and espouse what I know is true, or do I cave in order to keep my job? This sounds ridiculous and radical to be talking about that in the United States, but we're not that far, even in this country. We're not that many years from a turn that could take us there. And so in this election, the Supreme Court is going to be really critical for us. Another one, guys, to talk about is going to be the Electoral College. I mentioned that we wanted to talk about this. This is on the ballot in Colorado. It's on the ballot, if I remember right, as Prop 113, the national popular vote item. People get really confused. They say, what's the Electoral College for? So let me describe what the Electoral College is. When we vote for the president in this next election, this is kind of a little tricky, but we're not actually voting, we're not actually casting a vote that gets dropped into a ballot box that goes as a popular vote for the president. We actually vote for electors. So in Colorado, if you vote for Vice President Biden, you actually vote for a set number of electors that have been picked by Biden, to vote on behalf of Colorado. So if he wins the popular vote in Colorado, his electors get to vote, and they'll all vote for him. Likewise, if you vote for Donald Trump, President Trump, and he wins, then all of his electors will be the ones that are selected to represent Colorado, and they'll vote for him. Well, why do we have that? Why do we divide our states up like that? Why do we have it so that Colorado represents X electors, and California, it's all population-based, represents 50 plus electors, and Texas represents 30 plus electors, and New York, so on. Why is it divided like that? Why is it not just simply a national popular vote? That feels democratic, right? Well, one of the things the founders understood after studying history, and I won't go back on it too much, but is the tyranny of the majority. It's the idea that a straight democracy actually can be just as much a risk of tyranny as that of a king. And the reason it works this way is as simple as if you could get 51% to vote for something and it's right, then you can actually oppress the minority. And so what would happen if we didn't have the Electoral College, guys, is that the president, whoever was running for president, whichever side, could simply go to the most populous locations and try to get those. So they wouldn't have to appeal, in instance, to Colorado or to Montana or to Illinois or to Louisiana. They'd appeal to California. They'd appeal to New York. They'd appeal to the biggest places. And how would they might necessarily appeal to them? If they didn't have the Electoral College, they could say, look, this sounds immoral and crazy, but this is the protection. Hey, look, California, if you vote for me, I will take money from Colorado and give it to you. Now, this is an extreme as an example, right? But I will give you, California, all of this, all of this, all of this. I will just appeal to you if you'll vote for me. And by the way, I think this is interesting because in some ways we do this with classes today. Hey, middle class and those that are on the poor side, if you'll vote for me, I will go take from these people and give to you. We already kind of do this. But the Electoral College is designed to protect us from that on a national level. The second thing it does is protect us from fraud. If you have some bad actors in California, we'll pick on them, who wanted to defraud the election, they just need to keep pumping votes in California if it's a national popular vote, and then you can swing the whole election. But if you have the states divided up like we do, to commit fraud, you actually have to commit fraud in almost each state until you are at least enough of the states and for you to get the necessary number for you to be voted to elected president. So it actually restricts the ability of fraud because it breaks out and fragments the ability for the fraudsters to come in and change the election just simply by one location. Let's see, really quickly, we'll go to state issues. We talked about taxes. We talked about the national popular vote. There's a really critical one, guys, on the ballot this time about late-term abortion. For those that aren't familiar, they picked week 22. If you read the proposition about late-term abortion, it's about week 22. They said once the child has reached week 22 in the womb, you can no longer have an abortion. Now, from a perspective of Christ, the sanctity of life, the individual is a person upon conception. But when you look at how we were able to dismantle the slavery, we first started by getting rid of the slave trade. And then we were able to take out slavery. We were able to take it bit by bit. The piece to get rid of late-term abortion should be voted for. It's a heinous act. At week 22, with current medical technology, the child has a chance, a fair chance of living outside of the womb. They'll need tremendous neonatal care, but it has a fair chance of living outside of the womb. So we can talk more about abortion if we have questions on that, but even Europe doesn't allow late-term abortions except in extreme circumstances. A couple other things we talked about, a few others. One, Brent, we can talk about wolves. The reintroduction of wolves. I'll just mention this because Brendan mentioned he was out hunting. He was out hunting 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago, and was listening to the sound of wolves howling while they were out. I think it was elk. And I'm just noticing the wolves. We have on the ballot the idea to spend $800,000 to reintroduce wolves here in Colorado. Back to the question of should we raise our taxes? Sometimes we spend money on stuff that may just not be necessary. You may be very much for wolves being in Colorado. That's one thing. But the question of whether it's even necessary to go spend $800,000 in tax dollars to reintroduce it, you might want to study pretty closely on that. So here's what I'll end with, and I want to make sure we open it up to Q&A for the whole hour. So for scenarios, there's a couple scenarios that are going to take place here in this election. One is status quo. And what I mean by that is we get through November, Trump remains president, the Republicans hold on to the Senate, and the House remains in Democratic control. With status quo, what will take place is Trump would be able to institute the justices of his choice, pretty much, from the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett would be nominated to the court. The other two seats that likely will come up would be filled with justices that are similar to Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and Barrett, which will protect religious liberty. They'll protect the sanctity of life. They'll protect the sanctity of marriage. And they'll do a lot to restricting government overreach. On the flip side, if you end up with a Democratic landslide, what I would expect you to find is, first, with the courts, the exact opposite of that. We have a chance to overturn Roe v. Wade for the first time in my lifetime. Well, back, they had it in the early 90s. And it did, and I could tell that story too. In the early 90s, we had an opportunity to overturn it. It was actually 4-4. The Supreme Court has 9 people. The 5th vote was Kennedy, Anthony Kennedy, who'd been nominated by a Republican president, Reagan. But Anthony Kennedy, initially, what happens in the Supreme Court is when they first decide a case, they actually go into the little room. Before they've written the opinions, they all just vote. And the initial just preview vote, Kennedy voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. And we know this from some of Scalia's writings. And Scalia actually went to, Brennan actually went to the House later and said, you can't do that, and argued with him not to overturn it. He changed his vote. That's how close we were to overturning Roe v. Wade back in '92. This is Casey versus Planned Parenthood. He changed his vote. It would have been done right then and there. One person who originally said yes, overturn it, and then after being convinced, because the original author of Roe v. Wade went and convinced him not to, changed his vote to no. Scalia, by the way, Antonin Scalia, who was a Supreme Court justice, actually went to Kennedy's house and tried to get him to change back, and Kennedy wouldn't. That's how in the balance things are. They're on a razor's edge. If a Dem landslide, the court will swing far left, especially if all 3 come. Even if Amy Coney Barrett is installed, they're threatening to pack the court. And what that simply means is we have 9 justices now. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents it from being 15. And so they would institute more, or they would just create more seats on the bench until they had their way. If it's a Republican landslide, it would be flipped. And I think we've seen from the first couple of years with President Trump what some of that can look like. But it would be not too dissimilar from the status quo. The difference is that the House would also be in Republican hands. And you would have more legislation related to things that Trump has espoused to this point. So we're at hour. I want to stop here, and I appreciate it. I rambled on for quite a bit, and I appreciate you guys letting me do so. But I really want to spend some time just with questions and answers and anything you guys have you want to talk about. So Russ, we can open back up, Russ, for you, and see if we've got any questions.
Let me come back on here. Okay, thank you, Jeff. Awesome. Love all the history. It really helps keep everything in perspective, I think. Remember our roots. We know where we came from, we know where to go, right? So, yeah, if anybody has a question, I have not seen anything in the chat. I've got some questions that I've gotten previously from people, and I've got some of my own, Jeff. But if anyone would like to ask a question right now, you certainly can come online and do it. While we're waiting, Jeff, let me go ahead and pose a question. You were talking about Supreme Court. I think there's a lot of confusion about the role of the Supreme Court in people's minds. Maybe we just haven't been taught about that, or people don't understand. It's not a legislative body. How would you describe the role of the Supreme Court? What are they for?
Yeah, so I think first, there's 3 branches of our government, right? There's executive, there's legislative, and there's judicial. Judicial is where the Supreme Court sits. Our founders purposefully did what they call a separation of powers. They separated our federal government into those 3 branches, but they also separated the powers of the federal government and the states and the local. They did that, by the way, because again, they feared that oppression. They know what's in the heart of a man, and they fear the consolidation of power into a single place. Because if you keep consolidating power into a single place, then you just need an individual or a group of individuals to start taking more and more control. So there's that first fundamental understanding of separation of powers. The second thing is they divided it into 3. 1, because there's some precedent in Scripture for 3, for king, judge, and and people, I forget exactly where it talks about it, but there's some precedent in scripture for it. But 2, and most importantly, they use 3 because if one of them gets too out of control, the thinking was that 2 of them would be able to come and overpower and bring it back into place. That was the concept. That was the idea, right? But what the Supreme Court is meant to do, it's from Article 3 of our Constitution, and it's intended to adjudicate the cases. So it's intended to apply facts to the laws that are already in play. So the legislature passes our laws, the president executes those laws, and the Supreme Court is supposed to interpret whether or not certain facts actually meet the standard of that law. So if you, in the Supreme Court, let me just explain the courts. At the district court level is where you decide facts. Is this fact pattern what actually happened? So I used to be prosecutor. So we'd have an individual come in, and we'll make it simple. Did the person cross the street jaywalking or not? And we'd have witnesses that come on, and they would talk about whether they were jaywalking. This is not real. I can't imagine doing that. But they would talk about jaywalking, right? And did the person actually jaywalk or not? It was a determination of fact. But then the secondary question, which is the court's question, is was there, now that we understand what the facts were, do those facts actually apply to this law? Is there an interpretation, understanding of the law as written? And so what the Supreme Court and what the courts above the district courts do, the appellate courts, is they interpret the law. They help us understand, okay, when they said the free exercise of religion, when they wrote that down in the First Amendment, what did they mean, free exercise? Were they talking about getting in shape? What were they talking about exercise? Was this a gym? What was this? And you'd go in, I mean, being facetious, right? But you'd go in and you'd look and understand what was meant by that term, and to what extent does it expand, and how does it apply to the facts? And so every day when the Supreme Court meets, they're looking over and over about these laws and how they apply. That's what they were meant to do. What they've begun to do, and they've done for the last decades, has been to legislate from the bench. And what that means is they come in, and instead of saying what the law says, they say what the law ought to say. Those are 2 very different things, and it's one of the things you'll hear continually about why there's a lot of conversation around legislating from the bench and why that's a bad thing. Because in our government, we were supposed to have legislators make the decisions of what the law should be. And the Supreme Court was supposed to make a decision of whether or not it applies and how to interpret it, but not to legislate from it. And so the classic example, if you look at abortion, for example, there's nowhere in the Constitution that it says you have a right to an abortion. The Supreme Court created that right where it wasn't before. That's actually a decision that should have been with the legislatures. It should have been something the legislators decided, and that we as a people could vote for those legislatures and have them make the decision based on the will of the people. But instead, the court came in and simply said, this is how it is, which is very different than the way it was meant and designed to be. So,
Jeff, this is
Okay.
Henry.
Go ahead, Henry.
I've got well, I don't know whether it's a question or what, but you know, I was always told by anyone I've ever worked for that businesses don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. And then the other thing was like on minimum wage. You know, businesses always said, we don't care to give you guys all $30. We'll up our price on all the product in order to cover it. Is this still, would you feel that to be factual?
well, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Your businesses have the ability to pass it. That's one of the critical things. Whereas you as an individual, you can't pass it to anybody. A business can raise the price of their cost of goods, and so what's being described here is, if I'm trying to sell, let's say I'm in the business, Russ and I are in the business of selling bread, and we're competitors, right? And our bread is basically a commodity. It's basically the same. You as a customer will take out the variables. You as a customer are very happy whether you buy bread from Russ or you buy bread from me. It's basically the same in this case. There's not another advantage. What's going to happen if the industry comes and taxes Russ and I the same amount across? What we're going to do, especially if we've already gotten as competitive as we can on our price point, what we're invariably going to do is raise the price of that bread commensurate with the amount of tax that was applied. Why? Because our margins are already going to be thin inside a capitalist society. It's already going to be thin because I'm trying to compete. I need to sell more bread than Russ. I got to make some money. right? I got to feed my family. And so we are already basically where we can on the line. And if you come in and add a tax, I can't just absorb it because of margin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise that price. And to your point, it's going to get passed down to the individual consumer at that point. And people get real confused about this too. I think it was a good point. We get taxed by income taxes. We get taxed by property taxes. We get taxed by fees. We get taxed by sales taxes. We get taxed by stuff passed down from businesses. We are taxed constantly. And at some point, we need to sit back with a really keen eye and say, what's my return on my investment for all of this? But I think it's a good point.
Yeah. I have a question here, Jeff, in the chat.
Sure.
Can you explain what Amendment B is about, this repeal property tax assessment rates?
Yeah, no, this is a good one. This is a good one. So I think first, what you have is you've got a thing in our Constitution that ties our property tax rates to a certain percentage of the overall revenues that come in by the state. And one of the things that happens with home values and house values that have gone up in Colorado is because they've gone up, the percentage that those can be taxed at has actually gone down if it's going to stay in proportion to the overall budget of the state. One thing I would point out to this, I think this is what's critical. Again, when we talk about taxes, and this is critical. First, they argue that there's a loss of revenue, but they're arguing there's a loss of revenue because it's not going to stay at the same percentage. They're not arguing there's a loss of revenue in that our home values went up, so our percentage of tax can go down and stay at the same amount. That's not the point they're making. They're making the point that we're not having the same percentage property tax. But if we held the same percentage property tax and our home values keep going up, what's happening to the overall property tax you're paying? You're paying more property tax. So what this is doing is actually by its triggers is actually reducing the property tax that we'll be paying. I'm sorry, it's reducing the percentage, but it's, if anything, holding steady because the home values continue to go up. The second thing to note, though, on this one is that there are other forms of taxation that can cover, and there's a point made in the Blue Book about this. There are other forms of taxation that can cover this without having to change our constitutional protection against the state just raising property taxes on us. This ultimately is a protection and a guard against the state. We have another one, our Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, but this is a protection and a guard where they have to come and say, we need to raise taxes on X. So before we get so excited about the graphs that say, look, the percentage of property tax is going down, you need to first understand, is this going to create a true budget problem for them? Truly. Number two, can they fix it by simply cutting, which they can? Or three, even if they can't, is there a way for them to raise taxes that's still acceptable? And there is under here, that's not at the state level. It's going to be more at the local municipal level. And so my position on this is just like a lot with these taxes, they have more than enough money to accomplish the goal of the government, particularly a limited government. What they need instead is to manage the budget that they have better. This is about home price values rising more than anything. And because of it, there's a natural trigger that's been built into our Constitution to reduce those tax rates in order to meet the fact that we would otherwise be paying more. So.
Okay. So you'd recommend voting no on Amendment B?
Yep.
Because that money's already there, just needs to be allocated better, right?
That's my argument. We need a more limited government across the board, period.
Okay. Good. Other questions?
The
Jeff,
other thing,
go
Jeff,
ahead.
doesn't
Yes, Gail.
he do two other things also that they're striving for, is that our property tax would be more equal to other states like New York, Illinois,
Yeah.
California. And also the other thing is they're saying the wealthy don't pay enough. So the really rich, the really nice housing developments with the $1 million+ homes, they're trying to tell you they'll get taxed more, but everyone will get taxed more, right?
Yeah. Every homeowner, and in which case maybe homeowners are now defined as rich, right? But I think one thing real quickly, when you look at other states, you have to be very careful in the comparison one state to another, because what you do, there's a bit of a shell game where they say, oh, well, we have less property tax than so-and-so. Well, we may have a higher sales tax or a higher income tax or a higher whatever. And so it's a little bit of a shell game where they say, we're just trying to get in line with Rhode Island or whoever it is, right? Or the majority of other states. But you really, this is where it's difficult. You have to look at the tax matrix almost across the board to see whether or not we are overtaxed or undertaxed or overburdened or underburdened, right? And I think with almost all of these tax questions, the real question is to look at what the government provides on a regular basis and to understand if what they're spending, the billions and billions of dollars they collect every year from us as Coloradans, is in a place that's acceptable and right. Some of it is absolutely the form of government and should be, right? There are places like, obviously, education for the children, obviously roads. There are certain things that we need to be taxed on and they need to spend the money on. But there can be other places that we can look and say, you know, guys, I think you can go pave our roads and stop doing X, right? So, but yeah, watch out for that shell game. We don't pay as much property taxes. Well, that's nice, but Florida, for example, doesn't have an income tax. Texas doesn't have an income tax. Well, our sales tax isn't as high as Texas. Yeah, well, they don't have an income tax, a state income tax. So watch out for that.
Hey, Jeff, we had a question sent to us earlier about the Pledge of Allegiance. And let me just read that to you. That was an interesting question. It's not a ballot issue this time, but they said, I'm curious about what your opinion is on pledging allegiance to the flag. It seems as though that could be idolatrous as you're pledging allegiance to something other than God and Jesus. How would you address that?
Yeah, I thought this was a great question. So the way I approach it, number one, we talked about this a little bit with Romans 13, we have a responsibility to, in fact, Romans 13 even talks about honor and reverence to our governors and to our kings and to our emperors. There's a place where they have a defined authority under God, and we owe them, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, we do owe them what is theirs, and we have some loyalty. Allegiance is not in this sense, if it was allegiance and usurping the role of God, that would be one thing. But in this case, it's not, I don't see this, and I think it's a great question, but I don't see this as a case where I am pledging to the flag instead of to God, but instead I am pledging allegiance to the government that God has instituted over this place. And I will be loyal to it up until and to the point that it doesn't violate God. And that's what we see too in other places in scripture where you have stuff like Daniel and others, where if you think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they came to the final conclusion, this is the individuals, guys, that Nebuchadnezzar threatened. If you don't bow down and worship this image, you're going to be thrown into the fire. And the bow down and worship. Why? Because that belongs to God. Once the government asks you to pledge allegiance to it, and it's going to do something that is asking to be put in place of God, like it's demanding worship, it's demanding it's becoming the idol. That's the line crossed. You don't pledge allegiance to that. You don't bow down to that image. But as far as being able to have allegiance to your government and to be loyal to it, as Romans said, we're called to have government, and we're called to even give it honor and reverence. So it's an instituted piece by God. I don't think that's wrong, and that's why I think it's actually keen in our own pledge. You have under God. What I would say to this, though, just to make a point, Paul talks about he was using it in the context of food served to idols, and he was making a point, or not food served to idols, different kinds of food. He was making a point to one population that if your conscience is pricked about this, you should adhere to your conscience. And he was talking about foods and kosher and the ideas inside the Jewish culture. But he said you can have Christians that differ on some of these things, and they should adhere to their conscience on it. And so I'd encourage you, if you really have a problem with it with your conscience, like there's not even a mandate, I think, under this country that requires us to do it. But I don't have a problem with it personally. And I don't think it's a contrary to God to pledge allegiance to our flag. So.
Okay, thank you. Here's an interesting question that someone sent in, Jeff. Just addressed it to me. You may not be able to see it, but how do you address the concept that our American culture is strongly individualistic? And the explanations you share are also individualistic, but other cultures are collectivist. And your ideas of individualism don't work in those cultures. For example, with a collectivist approach, the Chinese Communist Party has raised 70% of the population out of poverty. Isn't that also a biblical approach to governance?
Yeah, no, I think it's really good. Look, a culture being collective or not collective, we're called as far as a people to love each other and to be in communion with each other and to be in community with one another. So first off, the difference is really about the form of government and not whether or not we should be individualistic and not be in community. We're actually supposed to be in community, whether we're in a free society like the United States or whether you're up underneath more of a socialist or communist society like China. So just to understand the distinction, you should still be in community with each other. And in fact, in a free society, the difference is not about, actually the difference between a free society and maybe the communist or socialist society and who takes care of the poor is the question. Who's responsible for it? It's not that in one country you think you don't take care of the poor. It's a matter of, is the government the right sphere of authority to take care of the poor, or should it be taken care of in another place, right? And it's the way God set up a lot of things is there's different spheres of authority. There's clearly inside Scripture the sphere of authority for the family. There's a sphere of authority for the person. There's a sphere of authority for the church. There's a sphere of authority for the government. Clearly in Scripture. And when you look at this stuff, if you compare the two different ones, we are not saying in a free society that we shouldn't come together as a community or as a church or as a body in a way outside of our government and take care of the individuals that are hurting, the orphans, the widows, the like. We're actually commanded and called by God to do so. The difference is whether or not you use the sword of the state to mandate it. And while what you can see inside China as a change, I would argue two things. One, they didn't see a lot of that change when they were purely communist. They actually opened up some of their market to free market. Number two, I would be extremely nervous in history with what you find in any government where there's a consolidation of more and more power. There's always that promise that we're going to take care of you, we're going to protect you. But what invariably happens is you end up with more and more control consolidated into a single place. And it doesn't take much for the human heart, which is naturally sinful, as we learn from Scripture. It doesn't take much for the human heart to infiltrate that once you have consolidated power. The real difference between, say, the U.S., if it's and something like a communist country in China, is you have a lot of checks and balances and separation of powers intentionally because we fear more the human heart expressed through government with the sword of the state than we do, an individual. And here's an example. When I was prosecuting, we have the Fourth Amendment, right? You can't just go in and search and see somebody's property. You can't just kick the door in and go get it. Now, if the police could do that, we'd probably solve more crime. If we could just go search everybody's stuff all the time, we'd probably solve more crime. You would see the crime rate drop, in theory, right? We'd solve more murders, we'd stop more, we'd figure out more conspiracies, because we would just kick everybody's door in and search all the time. But we have a Fourth Amendment that says you can't do that. And the reason we have a Fourth Amendment that says you can't do that is we fear the government abuse that would.
Whoops, Jeff got frozen there somehow. I'm not sure what happened there.
Yeah, I'm
Josh,
not
you know-
sure what happened either. He froze on my end too. You might have to disconnect and reconnect.
I don't know if he can even hear us right now. He got frozen. There's a great explanation going on.
Do you have his could you text him maybe and just tell him to disconnect and reconnect?
He might have just done that.
Am I back?
Oh, now we hear him.
Yeah,
Yep.
there you are. Yeah, you froze.
That was strange.
Yeah.
That was weird.
Okay. Continue on. I'm sorry.
No, I just think that the key there, I don't think you guys heard the Fourth Amendment argument, is just you can give government all kinds of power and it may become extremely effective at stopping X. But be very, very wary, because what history will tell you is that government will use that power in the end in a way that's extremely oppressive. And in fact, even if you look at the Chinese, back when in the Soviet Russia, some of the greatest atrocities in the last 20th century, where millions of people were actually killed, and this is documented and recorded, millions, tens of millions died. They died at the hands of these regimes where there was such power and control, such sort of the state. So instead, we actually purposely in this country picked a government that's somewhat inefficient on purpose for two reasons. One, because the government is not the answer to all of our problems. We as the people are supposed to be responsible for a lot of it. And number two, because we understood that an oppressive government is far more dangerous than even individuals or than those that are hurting, because the church can go and take care of a lot of those that are hurting, but an oppressive government can use the sword of the state to do devastating damage, like has been seen throughout history. So.
Hey, Jeff, would Venezuela be an example of that? What's happened there?
Which one? Venezuela?
Venezuela?
Yeah. If people aren't familiar with Venezuela, Venezuela was one of the more prosperous South American nations not too many years ago.
Okay.
And there was a consolidation of power back to the state. They began, and again, we talked about socialism, the definition of it. It's where you take the resources and the production and you basically put it under the control of the state. The danger, again, if we were to step back, if men were angels, if people were holy, the actual most efficient form of government is a kingdom. And we're going to see that after this age is over. When sin is gone, we don't need these checks and balances. When sin is gone, we're going to get into a place where Christ is reigning as king and deliberately making the decisions in a very efficient way. That is the most efficient and best way to do this. But because we don't live in a time of perfect holiness, because we live with sin, and because we have to fear and be cautious of the human heart and what it can do, we have to set up inefficiencies and checks and balances and things and walls and things in place to protect us from us. And we learned that from history. So if you go back to the ancient Greeks, they were a straight democracy. Well, that ended poorly because they found out there's a tyranny of the majority. If you go back to Rome, they found out if you consolidate more and more power, eventually Caesar just says, yeah, it's me, and takes it. And they did it, by the way, when they gave Caesar that power, they did it initially for a good reason. They were pressed on all sides. They were about to be attacked by an enemy, and he said, I promise I'll give it back. Don't you worry. They were an empire from that point forward. That's human nature. That's not coming down on Caesar alone. That's human nature. Human nature, we know there's depravity in the heart. And so you have to set up ambition against ambition. You have to have three forms of government. So if one starts to usurp the other two would have ambition to put it back in its place. So the danger that you see in something like Venezuela is they consolidated more and more of their power, more and more of their resources under the control of fewer and fewer people. Until eventually those fewer people, in the name of good, always in the name of good, always saying they're going to do what's right, ended up taking Venezuela and causing more and more harm. Now they may say yes, but everybody now is equal. If they're talking simply about class, if they're talking simply about wealth, that might be true because they're all equal in the fact that they've lost value significantly. So I think what you find through history is destruction when you consolidate power like that.
Good, good. Hey, another question here, and you can probably see this one. This is open to anyone to see, but it says, I'm very concerned about the subjects being taught in our schools. I even heard that they're trying to teach the Muslim religion. How can we stop this?
Yeah, it's not exactly a secret that educating the next generation is the way to try to shape the society, right? And regardless of what side you are on any issue, that's a known thing. In fact, the scripture says you should raise your children up in the way they should go. And if we don't choose to do it, the state will, and we have to be careful with what they're teaching them. So today, in our government, in the way things work today, the best solution to this is to unhinge the schools or unhinge where kids have to go to school from a particular place, to give freedom to individuals to be able to pick the school for their kids. Parents, I would argue, have the best view of what's right for their child and for their child's education. They're the most invested on the whole. and they should be the ones that have the right to pick for their kids. And so, in my view, the more we push for vouchers and for charter schools and for the ability for individuals for school choice to pick what school they're going to go to, the better the society is going to be, because you're not going to have it's a check and balance. You're not going to have a single unified source where everybody goes to get the same thing, and it becomes a consolidation of power that can be corrupted. It's the same thing everywhere, guys. The more you break this into places where it's fragmented, but it allows for freedom, it allows for choice, you end up with protection against consolidating in a single place and then having that power be used in a way that's not good. So what I would say is, if you can support candidates, and if you can look for candidates and for propositions for other things that support school choice, the better. One of the fears and one of the arguments against school choice is that it will take money away from certain school systems and put them to others. But that's ultimately going to be rewarding those schools that are doing well and encourage schools to get better. And so if you have the freedom to take your kids and put them into a school that's succeeding, or if you'd rather be, or if you don't and you have to be stuck with the school that's not, you much prefer to have the freedom to go to the school that's succeeding, right? And so it's just about freedom and choice. And I think once you have that, you'll be able to position your kids better with what the curriculum is. It'll also give freedom in curriculum, because underneath that question was, we're fearful about the curriculums being taught. So 2 things: one, school choice. The second is, pay careful attention when you're voting for for those that are going to be in your school boards, and make sure that you're involved with who you're voting for your school boards, because they have a lot of power over what the curriculum is going to be.
Jeff, the way you're wording that, it almost sounds like you're making school choice a moral issue. Even we don't think of it that way, but it almost sounds like a moral issue, because it's taking away, when you prohibit school choice, it's taking away our freedom, isn't it, as parents?
Yeah, it
Am I going
does.
too far with that?
No, I think that's right, because we as parents are responsible ultimately for the upbringing of our children. So the reason I paused, there's 2 things. The state is involved in educating our children for one chief reason. The reason we pay all this money, and this may seem obvious, but the reason we pay all this money in taxes, and the reason we spend all this time and all this effort to educate our kids, is because we have to have a educated population for the citizenry, for the state, for 20 years from now. The state is typically going to be about its own self-interest, right? And so it wants to educate kids so that they know how to read and write and do arithmetic, so that they can be functioning adults and go out and earn money and pay taxes, right? But as adults, we have an obligation that goes beyond that. As parents, our obligation is, especially biblical parents, is the upbringing of our children, and it is thinking. I know that the question had to do with particular religion, about Muslim and what they're learning about. It can go all kinds of things they're learning. Not just about religion, but all sorts of things that they're learning. We have a responsibility under Scripture as parents to be very much involved in what our children are learning and what they're doing, and to not have the freedom. If we don't have the wherewithal from a money standpoint, which is very true for many of us, if we don't have the time if you were looking at a homeschool standpoint, which is very true for many of us, you could be stuck because you're required to send your kids, and your kids should be educated. You're required to send them to whatever school district you're in. So I think it's a moral issue to allow you to have the freedom so that you can pick that upbringing for your kids.
Yeah. For us, it's also a spiritual issue, like you say, because we believe in teaching our children God's values. And so if they're being taught contrary to that, that's a spiritual issue, isn't it?
It's a spiritual issue. And then it's also ends up being a Supreme Court issue in a lot of cases. We've had a lot of Supreme Court cases that decided matters of freedom on religious issues based on whether kids had to go to public school. They had to go to this public school. Therefore, you can't have prayer in this public school because some of the kids don't want prayer that go to that public school. Well, if you have free choice, you can have a school that doesn't have prayer, and you can have a school that does have prayer. And you as a parent can pick which school you want them to go to. And then you have your kids at a school that has prayer, and it's not a Supreme Court issue anymore because the parents were picking, not the state. And that's the point.
Okay. Hey, if someone has a question, jump in there or write it on the chat. But let me ask another one here, Jeff. I want to go back to that loyalty test that you were talking about. That the loyalty test, the whole loyalty test sounds discriminatory in itself. You know, if I say I, as a Christian in a corporation, a worker, employee, and I can't go along with something they're saying, no, everybody has to buy into this and support this. They're discriminating toward me. How can that be right? How can they say, okay, we're not going to discriminate toward this group or these people, but we're going to discriminate toward these people? How do you solve that?
So here's the way to think about it. Our religious liberties have always, and I'm going to pick on religious liberties because this is where it's going to bump into it. They've always had an outer boundary, which is no harm to another person, right? And so you can go and do free exercise so long as your religion doesn't call you to go and sacrifice children or something, right? some terrible thing. At that point, the state should jump in and say, no, we're not going to allow you to start sacrificing children in Colorado for your Molech religion or whatever it is, right? So I'm using this as an extreme because there's an outer boundary. What they could say is that what I fear is going to be the argument is that by not accepting me for who I am, you're causing such emotional harm and offense that you are injuring another person, and for a basis that the state doesn't recognize. And I'm saying this is twisted. I'm not saying this is the right way. I think reason would argue this is not a reasonable argument, right? And that this is not acceptable. My concern is we are not marching necessarily in accordance with reason in the country, and particularly if we're not careful, we will very quickly find that what we thought were our protections ended up not being so strong. Because if we consolidate more and more power, and the view of those that are in power differ from our own, you will find yourself oppressed, and they will find some basis, whether it's like I was describing, you're by not accepting me, you're a threat. You're going to hinder me from employment. You're going to not let me be promoted, even if you haven't ever done it. It's as if you're just a threat, and so your religion is now harming other people, and we as a state are going to stop you. That's a theory on how that could happen, right?
Right.
But the reality, of course, there, Russ, is what they're actually doing is openly discriminating against religious faith, right?
And you see that happening. Right?
Yeah. In fact, if you look at the stuff, there's a lot of talk on white privilege and racism right now, and systemic racism. And it's interesting in this country because if you look at this, the only thing that's codified systemic racism today, and I don't mean to make too big of a point about this, but the only thing that's codified systemic racism today would actually be laws that are similar to affirmative action that say if you have two candidates, you should give one preference based on certain race, right? That would actually be the only thing that is demonstrating some type of systemic or codified or legislated piece. We're against this, and here it is in the law, right? If you look at the arguments for the other, I actually find the whole concept of the critical race theory and systemic racism is really disturbing because it's taking a collective view of a whole group of people based on the color of their skin and making a determination about them. You are collectively guilty because of the color of your skin. That's been done in history before. It was done in World War II. You were collectively guilty based on your race as a Jew. That happened, right? As opposed to looking at individual actions in individual cases and saying this was wrong or this was right. And there's a lot more complication in this. But one of the things, and this is a very summary view, but one of the things that's not being talked about is there is a concept right now with this whole race debate that's going on that, and I get it, there are influences that come from the fact that there was slavery in this country and from the fact that there were Jim Crow laws up until about 50 years ago, 50 plus. Those will still have impacts. I understand that. But one of the bigger impacts than white privilege or white individuals or whatever that may be is actually the perception that it exists. And what's being taught, back to what's being taught to kids, well, what's being taught to a whole community of individuals is that you are oppressed and you are a victim. And this is being taught to them by leaders, especially political leaders and others, that this is an oppression on you. And so in order for you, there's no way you can overcome this on your own. You have to have help. You have to have outside help from this. And I would argue that teaching is one of the biggest things that has driven the results that we actually see in our what we see demonstrated in data of differences, and particularly in the Black community, is this concept, and I believe they believe it. I don't have any doubt in that at all. But this concept that they are being prejudiced against by the system. And the system, I would argue, is not systemically racist, but there are complications in that. So, and well, we can talk about that and discuss it. Remember, we talked at the beginning, this could be a little bit difficult of a conversation. I wanted to raise it because I think there can be a multitude of factors that can lead to something, and we have to be careful when we look at something as simple as this is wrong because of this group of people as a whole. That's a very, very collective, dangerous place to be.
Jeff, I've heard this concept of institutional racism. Is that the same as systemic racism? Have you heard that phrase?
Yeah, I don't know if they're interchangeable myself, actually, between the two. Systemic, I take is pervasive within our, it may not be intended, but it's pervasive within our institutions, whereas institutional, again, I use them interchangeably. There probably is a definition difference. When I think of institutional, I go back to the institution of slavery. It was itself an institution. It was itself a thing, right?
Okay.
So maybe it's a subtle difference, maybe it's a big one, I'm not sure.
When I think of systemic racism, I think of going back to the way the nation was founded, the very roots
Right.
of our founding, which you kind of addressed at the beginning there.
There were, yeah, and that's not to gloss over that there were very deep wrongs committed and atrocities committed. That doesn't change any of that. But when you define the nation and you look at the definition of the nation, it was not one of a people looking, the goal and the theme was not oppression. The goal and the theme was greater and greater freedom over a long time. And it means now that we have that baton, and just because that work isn't finished doesn't mean that we should belittle those that started it, right? Instead, we should take that work and go and finish the work that was done. I think in particular, right now with all of this talk, this is a great opportunity for the church across the board to lean into the conversation, because I think there are very deep and real race issues as far as heart and what's going on with our hearts and how we can manage our hearts as a country and as a people. But a lot of that's going to be best served not by laws and by the passage of training. It's going to be served by the kingdom coming into the heart, and by reconciliation through the hearts, and by forgiveness and discussion and understanding and prayer. That's where the church, back to the spheres of authority, this is where the church gets to lean in. That's where healing can come from. The government cannot necessarily come in and mandate your heart to be a certain way. That's where God steps in, right? And so my hope and prayer for all of this is that we're able to find real healing and real change. But our story as a people is not a story of oppression. It's been a story of, albeit maybe it's taken longer than we've wanted, but of more and more expression of freedom. So.
Good. I don't want to step on anybody's toes here. Is there any other questions that need to be asked at this point?
There was one about COVID that I know we saw from email.
Okay.
So we could take and I can address, if I remember from memory, the question. One of the questions had to do with what should our response be, both with the mask regulations that are out there today, how should we manage that, particularly as believers, and then also what should our response be for COVID with the church? You know, they're shutting the churches down. They won't let us meet to a certain extent. What should our response be for those? So just tackling the two separately. One, with the mask, I know, you know, with wearing masks, the first question is, do they have authority? And then the second question is, you know, even if they have the authority, is this something that we should, is there any reason why we should resist? Is there a higher law against this or that sort of thing, right? And so I think to the first question, if, you know, there's some talk too about a national mandate for masks. There would be a general question about whether there's authority to do it there, number one, especially just by executive order. If the legislature were to pass it, the legislature passes all the time certain things that require, that are about safety. And they can pass laws like that. It's not unconstitutional to pass laws. It's our job to vote in who we think is representatives, who will make the decisions that we most agree with on those situations, on whether you should or shouldn't have masks, right, out in public. For the most part, those rules and regulations regarding masks have been more local, which is where they should be, both because it's different across the different countries, well, countries too, but different across the different states. And then also because that's where the power should be. In fact, when our founders set up the nation, it was intended to be not 50 because they had 13, but different states were each different experiments of what was effective. And that's true for everything, not clearly just COVID, but it was intended to be different states so that we could each go about with our own freedom how we best thought we could solve the issues. And so here in Colorado, do they have the authority to mandate masks? They do, particularly the county level, have for public health and safety, much like they might do a fire ban. They can institute that it be a policy for requiring for safety for wearing a mask if they believed it was right. Our recourse in that, if we thought it was not right, is at a time of is first to contact your elected and to inform them of your position on whether you think it's necessary or not. And then secondly is to vote, and to vote in who you think would make a difference for it. As far as whether we should adhere to it, my own personal take, guys, is when, while I know we don't like the masks and a number of us get frustrated with it, I see it, even if I don't think the mask necessarily does a lot to protect me, I see it as a way of respect to others that are out there who may be more concerned about it. And so I don't personally have a problem with the mask itself, at least for the short term, right? We'll see where this goes, but that's my own take. For the second question on the churches, which is I think the way more, the really big one that was in there, is what should churches do when the government comes in and says they're not allowed to meet? Well, I went to a program with Alliance Defending Freedom many years ago, and they're a great legal group that helps defend rights of churches and rights of others. They're fighting this right now, as are other law firms that fight for religious liberty. They're pursuing these sorts of things. And we can support them because it's not okay for the government to allow people to congregate for a whole host of reasons. Be it, there was, I think casinos were open, and not to congregate for purposes of the church, to see that as somehow less when it's a part of the First Amendment. That's going to be something that will probably be battled back at the Supreme Court, and it goes back to what justices we allow to be on the court that'll make those decisions ultimately on whether or not a church should be treated differently than allowing a casino to open, right? And if the state has such a low view of religion that it won't let the church open for safety, but allows all these other things to open, there's a real issue of whether or not there's sincerity in the safety measure that's being taken if they're not allowing the church to meet, but allowing others to meet. So that's something that I think needs to be fought.
Yeah, I want to go back. Josh posted, and I'll say he posted it to everyone here about schools. Back to school choice again, just real quick. He said one thing we're very lucky for here in Colorado is that you can put your children in school of choice regardless of district.
Yeah,
that is a good thing. Is that the same as school choice you're talking about, though?
Well, we are very lucky in that we can move district to district here. It does provide more freedom than in many places. What really would be the ideal is that instead of funding going directly to the schools, the funding is directed not to the parents' bank account. That wouldn't work. But the authority to direct the funding goes through the parents of the children. And so in effect, it's called a voucher. In effect, the parents dictate, my child will go to this school, and the schools that are doing better then or the schools are then incentivized to do better, because in order to win more of the funding, because you're sending your kids there, they have to be a better school. And so what you end up with is some competition instituted in between the districts, and not just the freedom to move from the districts. But the freedom that we have does help a lot here in Colorado. In fact, we have good homeschool rules which help. But the idea that you could then pick as a parent which schools you go to and incentivize those schools would also be important.
Yeah, good.
The teachers unions on that, charter schools and things, have been successful in limiting the number of charter schools allowed. And so that's where you get the long, very long waiting list for charter
Yeah.
schools. So it's not totally free to go. I mean, you
Yeah.
can't, there's not tons of them to choose from.
No, the best is certainly a full voucher where the parents have that ability. I think it also cleans up a lot of constitutional issues like I talked about with kids and prayer in schools and other things like that. Guys, I think bottom line on all this, and we can have other questions too, but I think bottom line, we talk broadly about this stuff and we've gotten even specific in some of the issues, but when you look at what's on the ticket at the national level, you have two different philosophies. And I know the personalities can exacerbate some of the concept of deciding this, right? But you have two different key philosophies and that's a good thing. We should have difference in our choice. On one side, you have a philosophy that wants to push more and more for a more centralized control, and they have they come out with very good reasons on why they want to do it, and I understand because the people that need to be that they argue for need to be taken care of. But it's not a binary decision of take care of this person through the government or they don't get taken care of. We have to remember that. But on one side is this concept of more and more centralized government control. And the other side is actually a concept of just holding it where it is, which is probably not close to what our founders actually originally thought when they thought of limited government. We're still a long ways down the road toward more centralized control. But you have these two different concepts. And so look carefully at what's on your ticket, understand these issues at that high level and why they fit into these two different groups, the Republicans and Democrats, the way they do. So
That's a good way to put it. So more control or less control, or not allowing more control, I guess, to the government.
And it's not that we let people go. If anything, it creates, if you vote for less control at your government level, it means you're voting for more responsibility for yourself, but you have more responsibility under the government. You should, it's not that responsibility left. You had it anyway. We as a church have to be active and we have to continue to care for those that are around us. We have to love our neighbors, right? And that's going to be critical and key in society.
So Jeff, that helps us go beyond this personality thing that so many people get hung up on. I saw someone posting today on a Facebook post that said, I could never vote for this person because, and they went through all this litany of things they disagreed with about this person just because of their personality or their past or whatever. This idea, looking more broadly, takes it beyond that personality issue into more, what's the bigger concept here that we're looking at?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's distracting to the real, both jurisprudence and government philosophy they're underpinning. And those differences have gotten more stark over the last even 5-10 years. They've gotten more stark on the direction that the two would take, which is also partly why there's so much, I think, I don't know how to describe it, but just intensity around some of this is because they're very different. They're becoming polarizing different views of what the country should be, right? And we have to be very careful as we start to enter into that, because once you get too far down, particularly the control path, it can get hard to unwind, as you see in a lot of places historically. So.
Okay. Well, when Susan and I get a chance to get with Jeff, we keep him for hours asking question after question. He very patiently helps us. Is there anyone else that has a question you'd like to ask here? Our time's almost up. Jeff, I have one final question. I kind of hate to come back to the abortion issue because it's such a hot topic, but I've got an ad playing on TV right now. There's a couple sitting there and said, if you vote for Proposition 115, I think it is,
Yeah,
or whatever that is, then that's going to end abortion, and they kind of, how do we answer that?
well, a couple of things. One, there's still an exception even after 115 for health of the mother, but two, it's week 22 in the pregnancy, right, is when it's cutting it off. 22 weeks in, right? So it's been a considerable amount of time traditionally for individual to recognize the pregnancy is happening and to make some decisions about how best to choose to do with it. The other thing is partial birth abortion is atrocious. At week 22, like I said, the child is developed enough that in some cases can live outside of the womb. I won't get graphic, but we effectively dismember that person inside the womb.
Right.
Without any pain killing anesthesia. That's not how that works, because they don't recognize it as a human. It's barbaric, and it should be ended. Now, on questions of abortion, there's a lot of things that are difficult, and I also am sensitive because there could be people on the call that have had to deal with this decision, and there could be people on the call that have made choices around this decision, and I hold no, there's no judgment in that sense. There's grace, there's mercy, there's forgiveness. It's not about that. At the same time, as a people and a population deciding how best we should go forward, I don't find much question in my mind when it comes to partial birth abortion. And this side, and it's rare, I side with the Europeans and say it should be outlawed.
Okay. All right. Okay. Unless there's a pressing question right now, we're going to wrap it up.
I have one thought, just wondering how much people really understand the Black Lives Matter. Could you give a little background on, it's not just, if that's too big, don't worry about it. But.
It's big, but I think, look, separate the group from the name for a second. I think every one of us as Bible-believing individuals should recognize that regardless of the color of someone's skin, their life is immeasurably valuable, period, right? And it's sort of interesting because I think just because the skin was the biggest color, we decided to go against that. We could have easily gone against hair color or anything else as humanity. We'll pick any kind of way to separate us. We do that constantly. We're good at dividing and discriminating against one another. But I think first it should be clear that your race, just as Martin Luther King said, we should measure a person by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, right? And so we've got as a nation to make sure that's clear. Black Lives Matter is a group. They are on record talking about talking about wanting both. It's Marxism ideas, which is back to that consolidation of power, and the destruction of a lot of what we have here, because they see it as bringing about racism. And this goes back a little bit to what I was talking about, systemic racism and whether it's here. There is a genuine perception in the Black community of racism that's different than whether it's there. That perception, though, can have real impact on how they choose their lives and what they go about. If you think you can't succeed, you don't necessarily try as hard if you think it's rigged against you. That doesn't mean it's rigged against you. And you can have two different solutions based on the truth of what that outcome is. But Black Lives Matter is not what it appears to be as far as an organization. You can go pull up their statements. They're talking about burning everything down and replacing it with Marxism. And why would they advocate for that? Because it's control. It's back to controlling the whole people. If you are looking for a utopia this side of heaven, you will not find it. And if you try to find it by the force of the government, by consolidating all your power into government and going and making people do what you consider to be right, well, welcome to every oppressive government that has ever existed on this planet. And there's a long list of them, because many of them started out with the right intent. They started out with trying to do the right thing. If you'll read up some of the writings of Fidel Castro in Cuba and what they intended when they were starting. They meant that they were saying the right things to help people to go and do the right thing. And what it turned out was people so desperate to leave, they get on any piece of wood to swim across to Florida. We're not going to be able to solve the problem that our Messiah is designed to solve, which is the human heart. by creating an all-powerful government. That's not going to work. All we'll do is open a door for tremendous oppression in history. Black Lives Matter ultimately is advocating for Marxism and the push of consolidation of power and the destruction of the freedoms that we know. It's not a good or holy institution. On the other side, the idea that our brothers and sisters in this country who have an epidermis that's darker than mine, the fact that they've grown up and they have been told that everything's against them, we have to find a way to get that to stop. We have to hear each other. We have to really come together as a body. We have to seek reconciliation as a church. All of that is really, really key and important. But that's the work of the church that should be doing.
Say one thing just from another perspective. I completely agree with the things you're saying. But the one thing that I also would want to put out there is that there's a major difference between the Black Lives Matter pack that you're talking about and people that believe Black Lives Matter. I have a lot of Black friends that are Christians. In fact, one of them brought me back to God. At the same time that the Snaveleys were bringing me back to the Bible, a Black friend of mine was bringing me to God. And he believes in Black Lives Matter. He doesn't believe in the Marxist movement. He doesn't believe in the violence. He doesn't believe in those things. And I think that we've been in a very dangerous place as Christians lately, painting a very broad stroke about Black Lives Matter, the Marxist movement, and that being all of Black Lives Matter. And I think it's very, very important that we realize that that is not the case.
Josh, I agree completely. And I may not have painted it well when I was trying to draw that distinction, but I was trying to draw the same distinction, that it's not, there's a difference between the movement and the group. In fact, I remember talking with a colleague at work when this first started, and how we have, and particularly right after the George Floyd incident, and how we have an opportunity right now to have a really important discussion that needs to be had in this country to get to some healing. And that I was concerned that what would happen, particularly with some of the writing, would be that we would lose sight of that conversation and of that discussion that needs to happen. And instead, we would lose the opportunity because of it, right? But I think that the point you're making is real. I also know from my own personal experience, I remember I ran track in college for at least the first 2 years before I left Louisiana Tech. And I was amongst the sprinters, and many of my friends were Black. And I remember sitting down at lunch, and one of my buddies looked up and said, do you notice something? And sure enough, you look up and there's a line down the cafeteria. Most of the white folks are on one side and most of the Black folks are on the other. This is the 90s in Louisiana. And we talked about it, and I thought about it a lot. And I know, while yes, there are racists that would be there, that's going to be true in any population. One of the things that was driving that divide in part was just not there. You go with what you're comfortable with, right? You know, you speak the same jokes, so the same language, the same context. So you sit down with the people that have the context you have and that know life the way you do. And it ended up in a divide, not because I think the person on either side of that divide wanted it that way necessarily. There would be some, I'm sure, but not on the whole. But just naturally as humans, we gravitate. And I think part of the work the church needs to continue, and that all of us personally need to continue, is to get outside of those comfort zones, to deliberately get to know people and to love people and to change. But I think, Josh, to your point, and I was trying to draw that distinction too, there's a difference between the institution, the group, and what their stated goals are, right? And then what needs to happen from a reconciliation standpoint and a healing standpoint.
Good answer.
Jeff, I just
All right,
wanted
we're going to have to draw to a close here. Thank you, everyone, for your participation tonight. Thank you for the questions. And thank you most of all, Jeff, for being so helpful in this, so informative. I think very, very informative for us all. The history, the answers to the questions, all of it. Thank you. We appreciate you. Yeah, so we'll just wrap it up tonight. Let me just say a quick prayer. We'll call it good. Thank you for all of you for being involved tonight. Let's just be praying that God's will can be done in this election, and through us as a church. I think Jeff's exactly right. There's so much that are heart issues, and that's where the gospel comes in. We are the bearers of the gospel, and we need to get that out there and teach people about Jesus and show them the way. So let's pray. God, thank you for the night. Thank you for Jeff and his knowledge, his expertise, and his interest in these subjects, and his involvement in them. And he could share so much with us. We're grateful for him for taking this time to share with us, and just his willingness to be involved in helping us to understand. God, do work through this election, we pray. Use it in a way that will bless this country, Father, and move it forward in a godly, Christ-honoring kind of way. Use us as your people, Father, to vote and to talk to people and to care for people and show them the way to Jesus. And to do those things, God, they're going to really lift up this country and make it a God-fearing place where your name is honored. So, God, we thank you, and just thank you for your church. Thank you for everyone here tonight, and those who are part of Cross Timbers, those who aren't. And we're just grateful we can all come together to talk in a kind, educational way about these subjects. We just pray your blessings on our week, and whatever days you give us, may we live them to your glory. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. God bless you. Good night.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for sharing your insights. It really helps a lot.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Good questions. You guys hung on for 2 hours. I'm impressed. Thanks, everybody.
Important stuff.
Thanks for the
Important
history
stuff.
lesson.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks,
Great
guys.
job, Jeff.
Great, thank you.
Have a good week, guys.
Thank you. Everybody have a good week.
Yeah, Jeff, I didn't think 2 hours would be too straight, too much. I think I could see how it would go 2 hours easily.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot too, for sure, that we could talk.
There is.
You can only talk a little bit about some of these things, but.
Yeah, you can really dig in, and I thank you. Thanks for all the history lesson at the beginning. That was great.
No, for sure. I
Hey,
appreciate
Jeff.
it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Pastor.
Have a good night,
Ron.
everyone.
Very interesting.
Good night. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Okay. Signing off. Yeah, I hope you felt like it went well, Jeff. You did a great job.
Thanks, Russ. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you are. Okay. Well, take care of Lynn's over there. Hopefully.
I will. I'm going to go check on her.
Call if there's anything you need. Okay. Bye-bye.
Will do.